Well, welcome back, everybody. Lesson 3 in Exodus. We have quite a few chapters to cover this week, but we're excited. It's really great content. So just a reminder, as you're getting into this third week of being together, you have some history in your group, and one of the great skills that we know helps a group to, and individuals to really keep on synthesizing what they've been learning is to actually look back and maybe in your connect time just say, hey, how did it go with the application that you had written down last week? Maybe you learned some lessons from the life of Moses. The Lord, put his finger on something in your life. Just ask, how's that going? What have you guys been experiencing with that? And then as you turn to this lesson, we'll be getting into 7 chapters in the book of Exodus, 5 through 11. And you'll see here on page 32 and 33, the first 6 questions are the same ones that we actually had in lesson 1. Then you'll notice as you go through this packet, they will show up every other week. So we kind of alternate our observation from now on between the chart, where we're charting characters and the plot like we did last week, and these 6 questions. So Trey and I were talking, and we're thinking again that these 6 questions are a great time to get your group interacting. So they're open-ended. They're not exactly looking for a right answer. You're trying to draw out from your group what they have been learning. So we suggest that you just take time and talk about these as your group can flow along.
Every lesson we're going to observe, we're going to interpret and apply. And so observe, we're trying to answer the question, what do I see? Interpret, what does it mean? And then apply, what do I do? How does it change? And so with observation, that again, there's not necessarily a right or wrong.
Yeah.
It's just, what does someone see? And it's meant to be an easy introductory, kind of roll your sleeves up, begin to kind of see, open your mouth, begin to kind of feel more comfortable with what we're reading and what we're seeing. And then interpretation, of course, is going to have more of a sense of right and wrong. It's a little bit more easier to kind of be more discerning as to whether someone's on target or off. And so let it be open-ended. I kind of, if you're the kind that always want to have a right answer, well, that's not what this section is doing. Yeah. So just trying to remind you of that. And as you kind of walk through these questions, some are, I think, even better than others, particularly, at least on this one, I think you're going to be introduced in question 1 to, again, some of the main characters in the story that we're going to see over the next big section of chunks of chapters. And so, of course, not just Moses and Aaron, the Egyptians and Israel, but particularly, I think this section, you get a little bit more into Pharaoh's court. We're going to see sorcerers, magicians. We're going to see some of the key labor officers that were kind of pushing the slavery stuff over Israel. And then I love, and I think you see this in all of our packets, kind of question 2 is, again, what are those big ideas? What are the big themes? And so you're just trying to kind of get a sense of what are these big concepts or big things I'm supposed to be seeing in this deal. And so we're going to see all these plagues, but what's that about? Why are we seeing plagues? Which, by the way, the text will say they're miracles. They're not necessarily plagues. And so what are we trying to see? And so big ideas for me, even in here, is, again, you're going to see Moses' first entrance into leadership. So he's going to be called. You're going to see all of his backstory the last couple of weeks. Now we're going to see kind of his first kind of moment on the scene. And it's not going to go great from the very beginning. And so we'll kind of get to learn from that and kind of what leadership is like and what leaders have to realize. You're going to see, again, that repetition of God's commitment to his promises and what he's trying to accomplish in and through Israel.
Yeah, so good. We also like question 5 because, again, that's another one of the skills of narrative is where does this section fit into the big, broad narrative? And actually what we think in this section, what's happening is the plot is rising toward the climax. So all of these things that are happening, Moses has gone back into Egypt where the battle and the confrontation is going to take place. And the things that happen in these chapters are driving that narrative to its climax that'll happen in our next section.
If Exodus were kind of a season of a TV show, it would naturally kind of feel like at the end of chapter 11, there's going to be a episode break and a kind of cliffhanger that would kind of makes you kind of go, what's happening as the tension is building and rising, and you're trying to figure out how is that going to be resolved? What could possibly happen next?
Yeah.
So
And then the observation skill here is just character dialogue. There's a lot of character dialogue in the book of Exodus. Again, this could be something that you talk about or not, depending on how your time is going. Again, no right answer. Just wanted to put it in there so that you can pay attention to how people are talking to each other. The one thing that we did notice that was interesting, though, in question 2 here about Moses' dialogue with the Lord. So again, like we learned last week, he is constantly objecting and complaining and really letting God know what a big lack of confidence that he has in his ability to do what God is commissioning him to. And that happens again in chapters 5 and 6. He's complaining back to the Lord and saying, "Why did you let this happen? You haven't saved us. No one's going to listen to me. I have faltering lips." And one interesting cross-reference that we came across was that actually the story of Israel from Genesis and through Exodus is recounted by Stephen in Acts chapter 7 when he comes before the Sanhedrin. But this is what Stephen says about Moses. He says that Moses was educated, and this is verse 22 in Acts 7, Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was proficient in speaking and action. And so it's just so interesting to think that Moses sees himself as being not proficient in speaking, but he had been raised in this court where he learned those skills. And so God is working with him even in his lack of confidence and his doubts and fears. So anyway.
It's interesting. I read a commentary that was quoting D.L. Moody, and D.L. Moody was talking about Moses and what we're going to see in, I think, chapter 6 or 7, as Moses shows up on the scene to speak to Pharaoh, is going to say he's 80 years old. And so thinking of the Acts 7 reference, thinking of kind of Moses' backstory, it would appear that, that he grew up in Egypt and was somebody in the Pharaoh's court, that in those 40 years he was confident, he was trained, he was privileged, he was in a position of honor, he was known, he was esteemed, he was a somebody. And then he's going to fail in murder, and he's going to run away, and he's going to become a nobody where no one sees him. He's in obscurity. And so now he's going to reemerge on the scene. And so you kind of have Moses, who thought he was someone, had all the ambition in the world, that's going to be ripped out and the foundation kind of shaken. And he's struggling to figure out, well, I thought I was somebody. Now I feel like I'm a nobody. And what am I supposed to be doing? And how does God going to use a nobody? And so you kind of see this kind of reemergence as he's trying to figure out, how do I thread this needle of security and ambition and place and identity? And so I think that's kind of what we're seeing live in these chapters with Moses.
For sure.
So interpretation. So we kind of give you a series of questions, and again, so much material. And so we're trying to kind of cherry pick what we think are some of the big things that we don't want people to miss. Again, we would always try to remind you the questions that are here are just a roadmap of some places you could take your group. You're always welcome to come up with your own questions. You're always welcome to cover a few of these or all of them. And so we never want you to feel handcuffed by kind of the questions we've suggested, but we're trying to provide a roadmap to kind of make things easier. But in question 1, we kind of begin in chapter 5 and kind of referencing this initial contrast that we're seeing between God and Pharaoh and the purposes that each have for Israel. And so simply put, as Moses comes before Pharaoh, he's recognizing that one of the primary purposes that the nation of Israel has is to worship their God. Pharaoh, though, clearly has a very different purpose, that in some ways he wants Israel to worship him. And so you have at the very beginning a clash of purposes that God has for Israel and that Pharaoh has for Israel, which is going to lead to our conflict. And incidentally, as you're thinking about Moses coming to Pharaoh with this request for a few more days off from work in order to go worship the Lord, that there's probably some built-in holidays. There was probably some built-in, even in the midst of the polytheism that Egypt has celebrated, that it probably even did allow some sense of freedom for some things. And so what you may have here, and the reason why maybe Pharaoh thinks Israel is so lazy, is that there could be a sense in which Pharaoh is going, are you serious? Like another religious holiday? You already have plenty of time off. And so clearly you're lazy. And so he ups the ante of their work to get them to stop making these excuses. The other thing here is that it's not just, in a sense, an employer who's upset with a lazy employee. that ultimately Pharaoh was considered a divine person. And so as Moses comes on the behalf of Israel to make requests for his people to go worship their God, the great contrast is not just between employer and employee, but in this case, why would a people go off to worship a God that's not me? The Pharaoh is not just evil incarnate, but he particularly is wanting all worship of himself, which is going to get into all the purposes for the plagues and the battle, in a sense, between Moses and Pharaoh.
Yeah, so good. And then question 2, after Moses kind of stumbles in chapter 5 and sort of Pharaoh's just like, I don't know your God, get out of here, and I'm going to actually make it worse now on your people. Moses kind of comes back, and so this question is what do these I will statements in the beginning of chapter 6, how does it encourage Moses? How does God come alongside and bring him back to actually the truth of who he is? And this could be a great question if you feel like your group would benefit from just like spending some time looking and writing and writing them on a board or writing them down somewhere. What are these I will statements? There are 7 of them. And what's really interesting about them is the first 3 have to do with redemption. They're like, I will bring you out. I will free you. I will redeem you. The 4th and the 5th one are about the relationship. So redemption and now relationship, covenant relationship. I will take you as my own people. I will be your God. And then the 6th and the 7th one talks about I will bring you to the land and I will give it to you as a possession. So he's resourcing them. So it's really great how God is like, okay, you've just had this big, failure here. You're doubting what's happening, and now I'm going to come alongside and remind you of my covenant promises. And really the contrast between who Pharaoh is, what he's extracting and demanding, and what God is giving and supplying to the people. So there's the question here about the reminder or the introduction of God's name as God Almighty. He's able to fulfill his promises.
God Almighty, or El Shaddai, is that idea of God, the mountain one. There's a sense of strength, of might, of ability, even in the face of insecurity and in the face of adversity. For whatever reason, chapter 5, in the midst of what ends up unfolding for Moses, reminds me of like a brand new rookie quarterback who steps into his first football game and gets just destroyed, or a brand new coach who's coaching his first game ever and his team just falls on their face. And so chapter 6 feels like God is coming alongside of that new quarterback or new coach and giving him a pep talk of it's going to be fine. And it's going to be fine, not because necessarily of your ability, but because of mine. And so chapter 6, and that kind of question too, for me, I kind of wrote it as a summary of, it seems that the antidote to personal insecurity and circumstantial adversity is always a reminder of God's presence and God's promises and God's power. Yeah. That's always how we deal with those issues as we kind of navigate our own stories in our own life. Question 3, we're trying to help you kind of think synthetically. So I love the little table we gave you guys of the plagues and the correspondingness to the false gods. And so what we're trying to do in question 3 is kind of zoom out, not from kind of each of the little tiny plagues, but why is this whole section occurring? What is ultimately God trying to demonstrate through these plagues? And the 2 key things to us was it seems like he's trying to reveal who he is to Israel, to Pharaoh, and to the Egyptians. That he's utilizing the hardness of Pharaoh's heart. He's utilizing these miracles of these plagues in order to be a teaching moment in utter full display, not through natural phenomenon, but through supernatural miracles that are unfolding to teach these people who he is particularly, and ultimately to show that he has more power than Pharaoh and more power than the Egyptian false gods that they worship and that they respect.
Yeah, so good. And then leading into question 4, then we're looking more specifically at how Pharaoh is responding to these plagues and asking what is the significance of his response, and then do you see a pattern of his heart? And so the second part of the question then bringing up the idea of the Lord hardening his heart. So as you walk through these plagues, you see how they're either forewarned or they just happen. But every time there's an interesting way that Pharaoh is responding to them. And he both sometimes he gives in and then he reneges. He's asking for forgiveness. It's very interesting as you look at all of his responses. Again, this might be something that you want to go into specifically with your group, or it might be something you want to keep up at more of a big picture level. But the idea that Pharaoh initially, his heart was hard, he hardened. So the first 5 plagues, it's him hardening his heart and responding negatively to God. And then as God continues to offer more and more chances for him to repent and to follow these guidelines, God just gives in, and he gives him over to his hard heart. And that's exactly what we think this part 2 is talking about. That what does it mean that the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart? If you look at those 2 verses there, it says, so that I may perform the signs and wonders among the people. So he's showing himself, his sovereign will being done even through the hardness and the sin of this Pharaoh. So it's for judgment on Egypt and for the redemption of Israel.
The background information kind of colored block at the bottom of that page I think is really helpful. It's a nice succinct description and explanation, just as Carolyn's walking through as well. Mm-hmm. Question 5, again, kind of we've said this as we kind of open this lesson, is thinking of the movement of the plot. And so as we go through these plagues, the tension is building, and particularly the tension of God hasn't fulfilled his promises to the nation of Israel, and it seems like the heat is getting turned up, both in the frustration of Pharaoh and in the lack of redemption and, frankly, fulfillment of God's promises to the nation of Israel. And so I think what are those purposes, what's happening through these plagues as we progress? I think ultimately they're setting up the need for redemption. And so by the time we get to the last plague of the firstborn that's going to be threatened as we get at the end of 11, it's begging the question of how will anyone be saved, and how will we see a reversal of these circumstances? It's also going to establish that the only source for redemption is God himself. So Pharaoh continues his heart and his heart. Even his advisors are like, please, Pharaoh, please relent, please let them go. But he won't. And so God is going to be the only one that's able to kind of break through these circumstances. And also I think we see the methods that God uses to bring about redemption are not just his divine power, but you get this beautiful weaving between his power and human interaction throughout that. And so you get divine power, you get human participation, you get the continual extending of opportunities to Pharaoh to relent, and yet he doesn't. And so you see this back and forth exchange throughout that is just building the climax to ultimately what we're looking for in the next lesson, and wondering if that tension can begin to break.
Yeah, so good. Well, as we turn toward application then, we've taken these first question here with the idea that that worship is kind of the center of this whole section. God is wanting to pull his people out of slavery and oppression so that they can be who they really are, his worshipers. So in contrast, the Egyptians also are worshipers, but they're worshiping idols, false gods. And so this question is just trying to just go right at it in our own lives. So, what idols do we see in our culture that we are looking to for security and significance, and to bring us something that we can't have ourselves? And so we just talked, people need identity, belonging, and purpose, and those can really ultimately only be found in God. And yet there are so many things in our culture that we run to: politics, materialism, careerism, family even sometimes can become an idol. And so this question, again, as you lead this part, think about it from yourself and maybe lead out in vulnerability. What do you struggle with that you run to instead of running to God first when you're looking for security in your life?
For some reason, whenever we kind of get into a Bible study or a question about idols, I always have a hard time just at some level finding my idols. And one of the things I've kind of realized through the years is it's more easy for me to find those false idols of satisfaction or pleasure or value when there's something that's shaken and I'm just out of sorts. And so sometimes it's easier for me to find my idols not in my false pursuit of something, but when something hasn't occurred and I find myself more wrecked than I normally am, then it's like there's something that spun me up, probably because there's a false idol in my life. And so sometimes for me, it's easier to see it in the backwash of adversity or the backwash of disappointment to ask, well, what is it that I've placed a false hope in? Or what is it that I've placed too much of my satisfaction in? And that ends up, for me, being a mirror that's easier for me to find them.
Yeah, so good.
I also we like question 2, not just the idols for us personally, but again, just tracking through kind of Moses's journey and his development through the story of what do we learn just even from our own kind of experience of discouragement, setback, disappointment, adversity. How do we respond in those things? What are we to see in Moses's example, good and bad? And what are we to see in ours as we kind of navigate through that? Lastly, every lesson we're going to try to kind of bring you back even out of application into an engaged tool. And so we want you to observe, we want you to interpret this text, we want you to apply the text, and not just some principles that are just about kind of what we find in this passage, but ultimately kind of holistically, we're also trying to build within each of us and within our group some disciple-making skills. And so it's interesting to me as you think about this actual lesson, so much of it is about all these plagues and gnats and boils. And well, what's that all about? And ultimately what we've tried to kind of highlight is God is utilizing those to show to a community and to a nation who he is. And so ultimately, as we kind of get into these engaged tools, so many of them are about helping people find and follow Jesus. And particularly kind of the one that we're going to highlight here on the bottom of page 39 is what we call our Every Neighbor Map. And it's meant to be a tool in your tool belt, helping you get to know your neighbors so you can make God known. And so thinking about the place that you live, whether it's an apartment complex, a house, whether you're in a dorm as a student, wherever God has put you, the idea is this is a tool to kind of help you begin to think through, do I even know the names of the people that God's placed right around me? That I can walk across the street to my mailbox. Do I yet know those people? And so one of the things you can simply do tonight or with your group is have them kind of write out their street, their apartment building, and can they put names on each of the units? Can they put names on each of the houses? Or can they think of a creative way to kind of pull neighbors together to kind of get to know one another? Is kind of what we're trying to help people begin to think through it and to make it not just an individual exercise, but ultimately kind of a group one.
Yeah, so good. Well, that's all we have for you guys this week. We'll be praying for you as you walk through this really important and interesting part of the book. Thanks.
See ya.